Thank you very much, Senator. Right on the button, Senator. Exactly 8 minutes. Senator Bacik. 8 minutes, and an excellent example now to follow.
Thank you, Lasclearlig. I'll try and follow Senator Bone's example, but no pressure. I'd like to welcome you to the House, Minister, and to welcome those in the public gallery who are here to see the debate. And I recognise many of you from appearing before us in the Justice Committee, and from just to acknowledge your long involvement in this area and in seeking reform in this area. I just wanted to say that. But also, Minister, to really just note and acknowledge your own immense contribution to the development of this legislation and your strong personal commitment to this area, to ensuring that we do have a modern statutory framework in place for the support of vulnerable adults. And I'm using the language that the Law Reform Commission used in that report back in 2006, which really set out at the time a blueprint for the sort of legislation that we're only now enacting. And I think all of us have acknowledged how long awaited and hugely important this bill is, and I'm really glad it has had such a general welcome both in the other House and here in this House. Senator Conway mentioned that as we've been speaking, the Minister Fitzgerald and the Taoiseach have been signing the marriage bill commencement order, and I think we all very much hope that it won't be too long before we see the commencement order being signed on this bill, because clearly it is long overdue. And at long last, it will provide, as I say, for an up-to-date framework to support decision-making by adults where capacity has become affected or impaired, and to replace our archaic laws, our archaic architecture dating back to the 19th century. There's been a long genesis for this legislation, and again, others have commented on this. I mentioned the Law Reform Commission report, and I looked again at some of the recommendations from that 2006 report, and noted that, as the Law Reform Commission themselves acknowledged, that in the interim, in the space between 2006 and when we first saw the scheme of a bill published in 2011, that indeed in that space of time there had been developments and understandings about best practice had changed and shifted. But back in 2006, the Law Reform Commission recommended the law on capacity should promote capacity by having an emphasis enabling rather than restrictive in nature and meeting requirements of constitutional and human rights law. And that's certainly a very important general overarching principle. In 2011, the scheme of what was then called the Mental Capacity Bill was published, and we ran extensive hearings in the Oireachtas Justice Committee in February 2012 on the scheme of that bill. We had over 70 submissions, we had a number of hearings, and in our report we made a number of recommendations for change, and I think most of them have been addressed, I must say that, and the bill that was published subsequently in July 2013 and that then went again to the Justice Committee, as you've said, really is fundamentally different, and even the bill we have now in the Shannon has again changed and been improved vastly due to the amendments that were put in the Dáil. So I think we all very much welcome the fact that this has been a very evolving document, and that it has evolved in line with our changed understandings of best practice and in line with, of course, our international obligations. Others have mentioned the need for the bill to be passed in order for us to ratify the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I think we noted back in our report in the Justice Committee that Ireland was one of the first countries to sign the UN Convention, but hasn't been in a position to ratify due to the fact that our legislation is so out of date in this area. So we've seen huge engagement with the bill, huge changes being made as the bill has progressed, as the scheme has progressed. And I note that there have been a number of organisations that have worked particularly closely in the development of the bill, over 15 NGOs representing persons with disabilities, older persons and mental health service users. So I know, Minister, you've found their engagement very useful too. And I think anyone who's offering changes or who's making suggestions at this stage is clearly seeking to improve the bill further, but also recognising the need to get the bill passed, and preferably before the end of this year, and I think at the outside, in order for us to enable us to ratify the Convention, but more importantly, to enable the putting in place of an effective and respectful system of supports for adults who need them so badly. I just wanted to mention some key points to welcome, and key points where I think we've seen real changes in the evolution of the bill, before just looking at a few other points. First, the change in language. I mentioned the Mental Capacity Bill, the scheme, and I'm really glad to see we've moved away from that language, and of course we're moving completely from the dreadful language of the Lunacy Regulation Act of 1871, which of course continues until this bill is passed, continues to govern the area. So really welcome that. Also welcome the fact that you replaced the Office of Public Guardian, which again had that paternalistic approach evident in the language, to replace that with the Decision Support Service. That's very welcome. In terms of language, but more importantly the substance of the bill, the old Head 3 in 2011 referred to the best interest test, and again we've moved significantly from that, and I really welcome that. I take Senator Zappone's points on Section 3 of the bill on the determination or construction of a person's capacity. I listened with great interest, and indeed in 2012, as the other senators in the committee will recall, we did recommend that the bill should be about legal capacity rather than mental capacity. And I think there's been a real shift to that within the language of the bill. And I read Section 3 together with Section 8 to see that the bill is vastly more respectful of the autonomy of the individuals and has moved away from that paternalistic best interest test. But I do think we might tease out some of those points on capacity and definition of capacity at committee stage. I think in terms of moving away from the one-size-fits-all approach, the bill is hugely welcome in putting in place these 3 layers of options in accordance with differences of capacity. And again, I think that moves away from that very dated model of a sort of inflexible approach that we have been stuck with and remain stuck with until the bill is passed. And that again is in line with the Justice Committee recommendations. We recommended that a human rights-based approach be put in place that would recognise that there are different levels of decision-making capacity, that the current all-or-nothing approach in wardship means virtually all usual civil rights are taken away as a result, and yet that's not appropriate for many of those currently being dealt with through that system. We also called at the time for changes to the enduring power of attorney. I know that's being done in Part 7, and that you amended that extensively indeed. And indeed, the changes to the wardship system are very welcome in Part 6 of the bill, because there are very serious problems remaining with wardship, and I won't go into those. I think everyone's aware of those. The new part on advanced healthcare directives is also very welcome, but I suppose that's one area where there have been some concerns raised. This is the Part 8 of the bill, the new part that you mentioned, Minister. And I'm grateful to Dr Eleanor Flynn from NUI Galway, the Centre for Disability Law and Policy there, and indeed to Fiona Morrissey and others who've raised the issue of the discriminatory application of advanced healthcare directives to persons involuntarily detained under the Mental Health Act in Section 68. So again, that might be a matter we could look at committee stage. And I welcome the fact that you've mentioned there will be amendments at committee stage. I should say that in respect of Section 68 of the bill, in Part 8, the Advanced Healthcare Directive, there's a particular issue that I think should be commented on, which is the provision in Section 68, subsection 6, about a directive maker, somebody who's making an advanced healthcare directive, but who then comes to a point where she lacks capacity and is pregnant, that there are some somewhat troubling provisions placed in the bill. I say they're troubling, but I don't blame the bill for that. They're troubling because they relate back to the 8th Amendment to the Constitution, and they're to be understood within that context, relating to the courts, the requirement that the Section 68 imposes on the court to look at the impact of refusal of treatment on the unborn. That's a requirement. I mean, we're all very conscious of the dreadful case last Christmas concerning exactly that, a pregnant woman who had lost capacity. So I think, that's something about which I think we should be concerned, but we can see how the effect of the 8th Amendment is felt even in this area. And I really am somebody who's always called for repeal of the 8th Amendment. I think this just gives us another reason as to why it should be repealed. And I know many will share that view, that it shouldn't be in this. We shouldn't have to say this in this sort of legislation, which is otherwise such a reforming and welcome piece of legislation. Other issues that have been raised, and just being conscious of time, are the issue of legal aid, the need to ensure that those who make applications for the co-decision-making process under Part 4 would have adequate entitlement to legal aid. Again, we can tease that out. And then the retention of mental capacity assessments, which I think is something that Senator Zappone has gone into. But I do think that the bill's overall philosophy, that the option chosen of those 3, that list of 3 decision-making support options, the option chosen should be the least intrusive possible. I think that's a hugely important principle, which really deserves great support and welcome and acknowledgement. And I think also the safeguards that have been put in place, and I know this was the subject of amendment already in the Dáil, and you've said, Minister, there will be maybe other amendments on this, in terms of the safeguards to ensure that, for example, the decision support service will supervise co-decision makers. These are hugely welcome, and I think will really add to the very practical, positive impact of the bill. So I suppose concluding, Minister, it's hugely important that we see this bill through, that we don't delay any further on it while raising the important points that we need to raise. We've learned massively over the process of development of the bill. We need to make it a best practice model. I do believe that, and I think that we're well on the way to doing that. But I do think that it's very welcome, in particular, to see Section 129, which enables the Minister to, in fact, requires the Minister to carry out a review of the bill's provisions 5 years after its enactment. So I think that provision will give many of us confidence that this bill can only be improved upon for the future. But it's a hugely welcome development.
Senator Bacik, thank you.